All right, today we're jumping right into the story of one of the most complex and frankly terrifying figures in modern American history, the man the world came to know as the Unabomber.
But before we get into the manhunt, the philosophy, or the myth that grew around him, let's just start with this one quote. This line from his own private journal really cuts through all the noise and gets right to the dark, twisted heart of the matter.
So, for almost 2 decades, the Unabomber was basically a ghost. He was this invisible boogeyman who triggered what would become the longest and most expensive manhunt in the entire history of the FBI.
I mean, just look at this timeline. His reign of terror stretched out over an incredible 17 years. It starts back in 1978 and doesn't end until 96. And you can see these huge gaps, right? He'd go completely quiet for years at a time, making everyone think it was over, only to pop back up with bombs that were even more deadly than before.
And here's the thing that made him so terrifying. He was an absolute master of his craft. His bombs, they were these intricate things, often hidden in these perfect handmade wooden boxes. And they were forensically clean. No DNA, no fingerprints, no fibers, nothing for investigators to go on. He made people afraid of the most mundane things in life, like getting on an airplane or even just opening their mail.
And throughout this entire massive nationwide investigation, with hundreds of agents working the case, they were hunting for just one person. A single guy who was somehow always one step ahead, pulling all the strings from a tiny little shack in the middle of nowhere.
So that's the big question, right? Who was this guy? To even begin to understand the bomber, you have to look at the person he was long before all of this started. How does a brilliant kid, a child prodigy, turn into a violent recluse?
I mean, Ted Kaczynski was, no joke, a genius. His IQ is tested at 168. He skipped 2 grades and walked onto the campus of Harvard University when he was only 16 years old. And people who knew him back then, they said he was quiet, maybe a little sensitive, but for the most part, a pretty normal kid.
But something happened at Harvard. That respectful, sensitive kid, he just vanished. His college classmates described a totally different person, a complete loner, someone who was rude, moody, and barely ever spoke. He was the guy who would just slam his door and never talk to anyone on his hall.
This huge, dramatic personality shift really brings us to the absolute central question of his early life. What in the world happened to him at Harvard?
Well, while he was there, a very young and isolated Kaczynski signed up for a psychological study run by a Dr. Henry Murray. But this wasn't just any study. It was actually part of the CIA's infamous MK-Ultra mind control program. For 3 straight years, they had him write down his deepest beliefs, and then they'd bring him in for these brutal, humiliating interviews, designed to just tear him down. And the worst part? They would videotape it, and then force him to watch his own humiliation over and over and over again.
After Harvard, he actually went on to have this brilliant academic career. He got his PhD, became the youngest math professor ever hired at UC Berkeley. He was on top of the world. And then, one day, he just resigned, walked away from it all. He moved to this tiny 10 by 12 foot cabin in the Montana wilderness with no running water or electricity and just cut himself off from the entire world. And it was from this little cabin that he waged his 17-year war. But then he did something nobody saw coming. He made a demand that would finally introduce his ideas to the world, but it would also be the beginning of his end. He sent a 35,000-word essay, his life's work, to major newspapers like the New York Times and the Washington Post. And he gave them an ultimatum: publish this essay, word for word, and the bombings will stop for good. It opened with this now infamous line.
The manifesto, called Industrial Society and Its Future, was basically this massive takedown of modern life. He argued that technology isn't making us freer, it's robbing us of our autonomy, that it's the root cause of all sorts of psychological problems, that it's destroying the planet. And his solution? Nothing short of blowing up the whole system and dismantling industrial society entirely.
So this put the FBI in an absolutely impossible position. You just don't negotiate with terrorists. That was the policy, period. But after 17 years, they were desperate. They had no leads. So they took this incredible gamble and agreed to have it published, hoping, just hoping, that somebody out there might read it and recognize the author's very unique voice.
And you know what? That gamble paid off. But it wasn't some FBI profiler or a linguistic expert who cracked the case. It was his own family.
It was David Kaczynski's wife, Linda, who first had this nagging suspicion. She urged her husband to read the manifesto when it was published, and as David read it, his blood must have run cold. The strange phrasing, the unique ways of arguing a point, it was all identical to the letters his estranged brother Ted had been sending the family for years. It was him, there was no doubt.
I mean, can you even imagine having to make that choice? After what must have been an agonizing period of soul-searching, David made the impossibly difficult decision to call the FBI and turn in his own brother.
And just like that, the longest manhunt in FBI history was over. But once the world started to get a look at the real man behind the myth, a much more disturbing and deeply hypocritical picture started to emerge.
When agents finally raided that cabin, they found everything. All the bomb-making materials, a fully completed bomb just sitting under his bed, and, most importantly, 40,000 pages of journals written in a complex code. It was, essentially, a decades-long written confession. And when those journals were decoded, they laid bare this just staggering hypocrisy. On the one hand, you have the myth, right? The public manifesto presenting this principled revolutionary. But then you have the man, revealed in his private diaries, who was petty, full of hate, and driven by what he himself called personal revenge, mostly against women who rejected him.
The reality of his rage was just chilling. He wrote about taking real pleasure in killing innocent people. He killed his neighbor's dogs just because they barked too much. He fantasized about murdering his neighbors, including their toddler. And maybe most damning of all, he admitted that he only used environmentalism as a cover, calling it an acceptable excuse for killing.
Kaczynski was caught and locked away for life, but his ideas, strangely enough, have lived on, often completely separated from the man who wrote them. And that leaves us with this really unsettling question we have to grapple with. Why does a philosophy built on such a foundation of private, petty hatred continue to find new admirers today?